So we have an interesting convergence of events this week. Okay, so we're counting the Omer, right? So that's special, and we have Rosh Chodesh. That's special. Rosh Chodesh means new month, new moon. That's what it is. So it's a time of renewal, and then we have Shabbat coinciding with that. That's special. We have all sorts of things happening on top of each other, and that actually changes our liturgy service a little bit this morning, but. Also, we're reading from these passages that have to do with renewal and purification. And that's really what I want to talk about today, because when Rosh Chodesh comes, it's a time of renewal. Some people call Rosh Chodesh Yom Kippur Katan. It's a time when we take Cheshbon Nefesh, the accounting of our souls. We look inside and we see what it is within us that needs to be purged, cleansed, just like we do on Pesach. This is that same moment. So that... Just like I said, there's a whole convergence of events. And then we're reading chapters from the Torah, Tazria and Mitzorah. They all talk about purification and cleansing and restoration and all these things. So I said, I really don't have much choice. This is what I'm going to be talking about, is purity. So my drash is called Impurity Happens. There's a parable that comes to mind to me this morning that I wanted to ask you about. You remember this parable that Yeshua told to his disciples about the unclean spirit? In Matthew 12, and specifically, there was a certain man who was rid of the unclean spirit that was within him, and that unclean spirit went out and wandered around and about in all the desolate places and found no home to dwell in, and so that spirit turned around and came back. And when he came back, he found the home clean and ready for move in. And so he took with him 7 spirits that are even more evil and wicked than that spirit was, and moved right back in to the house. You see, apparently even unclean spirits like a nice, clean environment to move into. I find that absolutely ironic when I listen to that parable, that he found the house and it was clean and ready, and so here the unclean spirit moves in. You see, idea of impurity and uncleanness sometimes kind of makes no sense, or makes little sense to us modern people, because we live in a world that is so different from the ancient times, when people were much more acutely aware of that. You and I live in a world that is so clean, so disinfected. I mean, we wash our hands so many times a day. We have little bottles of hand sanitizer that we squeeze and we pump, and we're like 99% germ-free all the time, just like the label promises, right? But the truth is, this is our world. When we think about the ancient world, they lived in a world without plumbing. They didn't have that. And a lot of the commandments that we read about in the Torah, they speak to that world, a world that was physically impure all the time. As you walk down the street, stuff that ran down the street in the middle of the gutter, in the middle of the street, was all the refuse that came from people's houses. There was no plumbing. So ritual purity was actually very, very important, and it was in the minds of ancient people a lot more than it is on our minds, for obvious reasons. So when we read the Torah, sometimes we are at this disadvantage. We're at this disconnect. So our reading this week, Tazria, begins with instructions about the woman and childbearing. In the Vayikra, Leviticus, chapter 12, 2, as we just read, it says, and this particular phrase struck me. It says, Ki Tazria yalda zachar vetama shevat yamim. When a woman gives a birth to a son, she will be unclean for 7 days. See, I read this as a modern person who live in this clean, 99% germ-free society, and it makes absolutely no sense. Why would she be unclean for 7 days? I mean, one nice soak in a bathtub, a shower would take care of it all, right? No, that is what Hashem says. And then the passage continues explaining about all the different timing of impurity and how long she has to be unclean and what the prescription for the purification ritual is. And then there's a sacrifice. It just goes on and on. Well, the obvious fact that when we read this, we can clearly see, okay, she gave birth, and that makes her impure. Again, something that we might not fully grasp, but this is one of those commandments that a lot of us read, and this is why, generally speaking, Leviticus gets a bad rap. People read and they say, that doesn't apply to me. That does not play into my life in no way. So Unless you're a woman about to give birth, reading that commandment, you're like, okay, that doesn't apply to me. I'm not going to have this. This is not something I have to worry about. However, as I think about this, every commandment in the Torah, even if it does not apply to us individually or directly, teaches us about God. It teaches about His principles. It teaches us about His character, who He really is. It discloses to us a little bit of what Hashem is like and what are the things that are important to Him. And how many of us do not want to know that? So the question I always ask is, can we not learn valuable lessons ourselves from the lives of people which could be very different from our own lives, very dissimilar? So maybe we can't identify with a woman who's just given birth, but I think we can still learn from this situation. Maybe this is the case with Tazria as I read this. So what can these verses speak to us today in a society that does not see childbirth particularly as defiling or any of these things? Well, I'll be honest with you, it's very hard for me to make a connection because I realize our modern world is so different. We live in a world that is so unlike the ancient world. In some ways it is unlike, in some ways it's just like it. We live in a world that is polluted. We live in a world that is thoroughly broken. And we live in a world where people don't even see the extinguishing the lives of the unborn children as something problematic. Impurity seems like a non-issue. Being unclean for 7 days after giving birth to a child seems like a non-issue when you're talking about people just ending the lives of children prematurely. But this is not new. I think to the days of Pharaoh when he chose to control the population growth in Israel, and what did he do? He cut the lives of those children short the same way. Just as they were coming out, the instructions were given to the women who are delivering. Just put them out. This is nothing is different in that sense. Killing babies as they were being born. Now, in the ancient and Greek and Roman world, I don't know if you know this or not, if the method of contraceptions didn't work, if the miscarriage could not be brought on, people had a child and they simply left that child on the side of the road. And the child would survive a few hours maybe at best, unless a stranger mercifully would find that child. That's about all that they would get as a chance in this world. And so that's the world we live in. In some ways, it's not new. People have been doing these kinds of things since the beginning of time. And in some ways, here we are, in a light society, 99% germ-free, yet we still continue to do things like that. In many ways, we have not changed. And so, yes, impurity seems like the least of our worries. And Torah, honestly, teaches us a lot of universal ideas. A lot of times, as I bring the words from the Torah, I try to focus on words that would apply to, in the broadest way possible, to everyone who is listening on the internet or sitting over here, wherever you are with the Lord. My goal is always to give you the words that you can take home and something that sinks into your daily life. But as I read these words, I realize that the Torah really addresses the holy community. It addresses community about the matters of holiness. And these things should matter to the holy community because we're called to a better life than leaving children on the side of the road for a few hours to survive. For Jews, defilement and impurity are relevant because, well, frankly, they're relevant to God, if for any other reason. So here are a couple of ideas that I have for you of how this Tazria passage may apply to our lives in a more broader sense. Keep it in mind that this is really about holy living. That's really what we're talking about. Impurity, point number one. Impurity is a part of our daily life, but we should deal with it. That just because it is a part of our daily life doesn't mean that we should ignore it. So, we live in a world where impurity is simply inescapable. If you read the Torah and you understand how that process happens, you just have to be human, basically. And your biological process will make you impure from time to time, just like giving birth right here. Impurity happens. It's a part of our daily life. We can pretend that it doesn't exist, we can pretend it's not important, or we can focus on the fact that Hashem decided to point that out to us, and we can acknowledge it. It's important. It happens. And God cares. As I read Brit Chadashah, it's full of admonitions about living pure lives. I don't know, there's just so many passages I can't even start listing them off all the time. Now,
To be fair, as we read about purity and impurity, we don't have to worry about the temple right now. We don't have the temple in our midst. A lot of the concerns of impurity was to defile the holy place, to defile the temple. And temple is the place where Hashem dwells. This is where his Shekhinah, his glory, his physical manifest presence is right there with us. This is how it was since the beginning of time. And so, even though the temple is not here right now, I have to ask you, if you believe that we interact with in a like manner with God today, if you believe that he is with us and he is present, then should we not be concerned with the kinds of things that we would be concerned even if the temple was here? God is holy, God is pure. That has not changed. The presence of the altar may not be here, but Hashem is the same. So the question that comes up in my mind is, why would we entangle God in our impurity if we can help it? So that's why we don't ignore it. The issues of purity and impurity are important to us. The laws of purity were set up as guardrails, designated to minimize the negative impact that we have with our impurity on Hashem and really the other people around us, the world around us, because people all around us also interact with Hashem. So that's my point number one. Point number two is that impurity is temporary, but it can have far-reaching effect. Think with me for a second about this. Impurity happens, right? But we shouldn't minimize it. It's a matter that is important to God, and I ask the question why, and the only answer I keep coming up with is it's a symbol of death. That's really what it means. And Hashem cannot be in the same, so to say, space with death. Because it's the opposite of who he is. He's life, and we were destined to life. Yet we live in a world that is constantly brings us death. Now, death wasn't always part of our destiny, right? In Gan Eden, we were supposed to live forever. It was never supposed to end. But death came as a result of disobedience, and now we have to deal with that consequence. So impurity creates an atmosphere where God will not dwell. That's why it's so important for us to not ignore it. If we want God to dwell with us, if we want for God to dwell in us, then we should care about these things. Does defilement matter? When I put it like that, of course it does. Shaul taught his disciples to live pure lives, as I mentioned before, and not to defile themselves. And the kind of defilement that he talked to them is a lot of people would not struggle with, particularly today, but in their world, it was the forbidden relationships that they were not supposed to be engaging in. It was the idolatry and blood. Those are the things that were specifically and profusely multiple times forbidden to the new disciples from the nations. Because these things defile us. And there's many more that can be added to the list, but that was the short list they got. You see, defilement is technically not sin. And this is where the territory gets dangerous. It's technically not sin, but it creates an atmosphere in where sin can take root. And there are things in our lives that are technically are not sin. But if we allow them to be, sin can take root, and it can take us completely off course. There are quite a number of human behaviors that you may think about that are sort of similar. I'm going to ask you a question. Is it sinful to think thoughts? Maybe thoughts that cross the lines, maybe thoughts that are inappropriate, maybe thoughts that are impure? Thoughts are just thoughts. What are the commandments? Commandments tell us do not do this, do not do that. It doesn't say do not think this or do not think that. So when we are thinking thoughts that are not exactly pure, we're in that territory. We're not really in sin, but we're kind of in that state of really defiling ourselves. Our mind, our body become affected by the things that we dwell upon. And the next stage, perhaps, and this is, for many people, this is a next stage, unwholesome things that we think sometimes come out of our mouths. We say things that we shouldn't say. We use words we should not use. We use the language that we would be ashamed to use as we stood before Hashem, right? And then those words that are inappropriate Are they technically sin? Well, it would be hard-pressed to find some mitzvah to me that tells me that saying that word is sin. But it is pollution. It is defilement. Because now is not only our mind is defiled, now our speech is started to come out. And now that is affecting the world around us. But you know what happens next? Because first we think it, then we say it. The next thing is what we do. Then we do it. And this is where defilement finds its destination, essentially. That's where we start actually impacting the world around us by the things that we vocalized, and now we're starting to live them out. Now we start to do them. So that's where we cross the line. That's where we manifest into sin. And now people can point things out to us. But you see, it begins on that slippery slope of defilement. It begins on the inside. So Yeshua's parable that I started with, by the way, I don't think that parable is about a person. I think that parable is about the nation of Israel. I think it's about a people corporately. I think the house that he was speaking of is the house of Israel. Because you see, Israel was cleansed through the exile. When the people of Israel went to Babylon, their biggest sin was impurity, defilement, and idolatry. And Israel was cleansed from those sins thoroughly. Idols were absolutely extinguished from the land. When the Israelites came back from Babylon, idolatry was no longer the issue. But the house was left empty because Hashem's Spirit did not live in that house. That house was not filled with Hashem. And as a result, further dispersion came. Yeshua cried over the city. The prophets cried over the city because they all saw the coming destruction. May we learn from this lesson of what leaving a house that's empty of Hashem's presence can do to us. Because I really think we have so many lessons on a personal level and on a corporate level as a nation. We are where we are. We stand where we stand because perhaps God's Spirit did not fill that home. And that's what you and I should seek about every day. So is impurity important? Well, it is to Hashem. So if we want to invite him in, it should be to us.